Well, now we'll discuss these cases that I've assigned here, and both of these are cases that I wrote for this course. And both are based on my research on these topics. So, for example, the Brazil versus the U.S. at the WTO case is based on my research and my interviews, for example, with WTO officials, including the Brazil's ambassador to the WTO, who later went on to become the current Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo. So let's talk about that case first. Then we'll get to the U.S.-China wind power dispute. What I think is interesting about this case is it does, tell you, I hope that I was able to explain clearly enough in the case itself how the WTO resolves trade disputes, what the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism is and how it works and how it's different from the GATT's dispute settlement process. But then as we go along in this case, you'll see that the focus of this particular case is on subsidies. And in particular, you'll see that one of those agreements that the WTO oversees, the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, is specifically what is at issue here, because what the objection was, what the Brazilian government said, is that the U.S. government was giving a prohibited subsidy to U.S. cotton farmers, and that is one of the reasons it was very difficult for Brazilian cotton farmers to export their products to the United States. And so the case makes that distinction between what are prohibited subsidies versus what are actionable subsidies. I think that's one of the most important things. It's something if you're getting one of these subsidies, you might want to know, hey, are we getting a prohibited subsidy that potentially could go away if there's a trade dispute involved? That's why this kind of thing is useful to look at. As we get into the case, you'll see that there was clearly an objection that the Brazilian government had to what the U.S. was doing with its cotton subsidies, right? And the main dispute, which you'll see in the case, was clearly, right, that the U.S. was giving these kind of benefits, financial benefits, the U.S. government was giving these benefits to these big U.S. cotton farmers that really made it difficult for Brazil to export its products, not just to the United States, but to anywhere in the world. Because here in the U.S. now, it was so easy for these giant cotton, cotton farmers in the United States, if they had a bad year, well, they would essentially be bailed out in a sense. You see the details. Now, the exact intricacies and details of these subsidies, it gets so complex. That isn't really what concerns us. But what does concern us was, does this meet the criterion for a prohibited subsidy, a prohibited export subsidy? In other words, was there a subsidy here, a financial benefit the U.S. government was giving to the U.S. cotton farmers that expected them to export, right? And since the only way they could get the benefit is if they were exporters, I think that it was pretty obvious, pretty clear, this was an export subsidy. So clearly the U.S. was engaged here in something that was a violation of the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, which clearly outlined that export subsidies, that if the government gives a financial benefit that requires the company to export, the only way you can get this benefit was to export, that is a prohibited subsidy. That distorts international trade. That is something that WTO doesn't permit. So that's why Brazil knew it was in the right. There was no question. Everyone knew the U.S. was breaking the rules in this case. So what did Brazil do to get the attention of the U.S. Trade negotiators? Well, Brazil won the dispute, right? And so the WTO said, well, Brazil, you of course, as we normally do, we would authorize retaliatory measure in the form of tariffs. Brazil, you can impose some tariffs, high taxes on imports of something that the U.S. likes to export to you. But Roberto Azevedo said, the Brazil's ambassador to WTO at the time, he said, that's not going to be effective, right? That won't get the U.S. attention. They'll just scoff. They'll say that won't affect us. We don't care. Go ahead, Brazil, retaliate if that's all you're going to do. So Roberto Azevedo said to the WTO, and this is, again, he was still just Brazil's ambassador to WTO at the time. He said, look, we need something more powerful to get the attention of the United States. WTO, will you allow us to revoke patent protection for U.S. pharmaceutical products if they don't drop this unfair trade practice? Will you allow us to just simply go out there and copy U.S. pharmaceutical products, have Brazilian pharmaceutical companies copy them and not pay any royalty payments to the U.S. Pharmaceutical companies? Will you allow us to copy Hollywood movies and not pay any copyrights to the Hollywood movie studios? That'll get the attention of the United States. And boy, was he right, because the U.S. trade negotiators said, please, please don't do that. We beg you not to impose that. That would be terrible. But Roberto Azevedo, it was too late. He had already asked the WTO for this, and he got the approval for this. And the trade negotiators were scared out of their minds, the U.S. trade authority, because they thought, what would be the precedent if Brazil got away with this? The WTO was allowing them to do this. If they actually implement this, other countries could follow suit. This could devastate the U.S. economy. So that's how this Roberto Azevedo is a sharp guy, right? He knew how to do this. They begged him, don't do this. What can we do? What can we do for you not to do this? So he came up with an alternative. He said, okay, I've been authorized to impose this retaliatory measure. The WTO recognized that trade tariffs would not be sufficient. So I'll make a deal with you. You pay Brazilian cotton farmers a subsidy. We've been authorized to implement, I don't remember the exact amount. You can see in the case, a certain over $100 million in tariffs a year. Okay, you pay our Brazilian cotton farmers a subsidy of that amount. We'll set up a cotton institute. We'll have that distributed to the Brazilian cotton farmers. You pay a subsidy. We'll have your U.S. taxpayers now helping to finance some payments to Brazilian cotton farmers, okay? So that's what Roberto Azevedo did. And the U.S. trade negotiators said, okay, well, that's much better than revoking patent protection or copyright protection for movies or pharmaceutical products. Of course, we'll do that. We'll do that. What's that, $100 million plus? Nothing. That we'll do that, no problem. But you see, Roberto Azevedo knew that when he did that, when they agreed to that, that would be effective, because when the U.S. Farm Bill came up for negotiation and U.S. senators and others were discussing this and negotiating this, they would notice, why are we giving these massive subsidies to U.S. cotton farmers? Wait a minute. We're also giving subsidies to Brazilian cotton farmers? U.S. taxpayer? Why are we doing this? Oh, it's a deal we made so we could keep this unfair trade practice. We could waste money because we want to keep giving these unfair subsidies to U.S. cotton farmers. That got the attention of U.S. senators. And U.S. senators around the United States, Senator Flake, the then senator from Arizona, stood up and said, this is ridiculous. This violates all the rules of free trade that we believe in as a Republican Party. What are we doing? So the bottom line is that caused huge embarrassment in the United States. There were newspaper articles. Someone interviewed a Brazilian cotton farmer who said, yeah, I just bought a new helicopter. That was a gift of President Obama from U.S. taxpayers. Paid for it. Thank you. So I think that got a lot of attention, and that was so embarrassing to the U.S. Officials that guess what? They actually began to take some actions. They began to cut the U.S. subsidies to U.S. cotton farmers, and this was what Roberto Azevedo had wanted. So he was effective. He was effective in doing this. And so the U.S. cotton farmers that had been relying on these subsidies now found that their subsidies were in jeopardy. And so I think this is a brilliant way that Roberto Azevedo was able to do this. No wonder that people looked in admiration. Other members of the WTO said, we like this guy. Look, he took on the U.S. and won. We want him to be Director General of WTO. And they made him Director General. And I saw that as a mixed blessing. I think, okay, he's very effective, but he had promised me when he was merely the Brazilian ambassador to WTO that he would speak with my students and meet with, and now he's too busy. He's Director General of WTO. Okay. So I had a negative view of that in some ways, but you see why this was effective. Okay. So the bottom line is, I think there are lessons here for U.S. managers. Maybe one of the lessons is, sometimes the WTO can be effective, and if you're heavily relying on subsidies. Your industry is just so dependent on that's what you need to survive. You may be in danger. If those subsidies are prohibited subsidies, watch out, right? And so this is something to notice. And so that I think was one of the big lessons of this case. Now the next case, also an important case, and I purposely made it very short, very brief. But again, you see the source of this dispute also revolves around subsidies, right? Because here the Chinese government was giving subsidies that, again, we know from looking at the case, this is according to the WTO Subsidies Countervailing Measures Agreement. These were prohibited subsidies. These were subsidies contingent on a certain amount of domestic content. And again, this was a financial benefit the Chinese government was giving that distorted international trade. So how was it contingent on domestic content? They were saying, okay, U.S. Wind turbine companies, you want to invest here in China. You want to manufacture in China. You want to sell your wind turbines in China. This is a very interesting growth sector, wind turbines, because people want to get away from fossil fuels. They want renewable energies. Wow, they're very great. Oh, great. Okay, you can invest here. But guess what? In fact, we're going to give you a nice subsidy, a financial benefit from the Chinese government. Really big, generous payout to you. Provided that, on the condition that, contingent upon you're having a domestic partner, Chinese wind turbine company, right? And sure, you can have the majority benefit, but we'd expect that over time you would transfer a lot of your technology, how to make these wind turbines, to your Chinese partner, you see? And so this is clearly a violation of the domestic content provision, the prohibited subsidy. How did China get away with this? Well, remember, when China joined the WTO in 2001, they were given 9 years before they had to be fully compliant with all the rules of the WTO, all the agreements, including the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement. So they did this in the mid-2000s before they had to be compliant. They were getting away with it. The U.S. couldn't do anything. We had to wait until 2010, right? And then sure enough, on schedule, 2010, the USTR took action, right? And decided we're going to take them to the WTO. This is clearly a violation. And so I think that is what made this interesting. Now, obviously, the WTO was going to rule in favor of the United States. This is one the U.S. was going to win. It was a hands down. Everybody knew it. China government knew it. U.S. government knew it. But I think what is interesting is it was so obvious that it was going to lose that China just backed down. And at that very initial stage, remember we talked about the timely step-by-step process. They got to the mediation phase and they said, we give up. We give up. Okay. So I think that is interesting. Now, there's some interesting things. So the Chinese government backed down because it knew it was going to lose. And so it was obvious, everybody would agree that it was going to win. The U.S. was going to win this dispute in the WTO. That's why China didn't even proceed. Now, the fact that the WTO, the U.S. was able to take this kind of action, was able to bring the U.S., the Chinese government to the WTO. In fact, every single time up to this point that the U.S. has brought a case, a dispute against China in the WTO, we have won the dispute, okay? And this was one of these. But I think what is interesting about that is the Obama administration's stance on this issue, right? Took the issue to the WTO, and in some ways you could say, well, maybe they were just enforcing the embedded liberal regime, making sure China followed the rules, using the WTO as it should be used, as a strong multilateral government institution embedded, built into the global economy to make sure the rules were followed, that the global economy continued to function well, free trade prevail. The embedded liberal view that everybody could prosper under this kind of conditions, right? But an economic nationalist might say, well, maybe the Obama administration was just pursuing its own national interest here. And, you know, a structuralist might say they were in the pockets of the wind turbine industry. Okay. The steel industry, you could make these kinds of arguments. But I think what is interesting is who actually brought the dispute forward, who brought this issue to the attention of the U.S. authorities, pressured them to do it. It wasn't the steel companies in the United States that were helping to make the wind turbines. It wasn't the The wind turbine manufacturers themselves, they didn't bring the dispute. They knew the dispute would have been in their favor, but they didn't bring the dispute. Who brought the dispute to the attention of the U.S. authorities was not General Electric. The big U.S. wind turbine manufacturer was making a lot of wind turbines in China. It was not Gamesa, the Spanish firm. Foreign firms didn't bring the dispute, and they didn't do it because they were fearful of potential retaliation by the Chinese governments. They might have said, okay, we won't let you invest at all here. The Chinese government has a lot of clout that way. So what happened? Who brought the dispute? The U.S. Steel Workers of America. The union brought the dispute, right? So the structuralists would have a hard time explaining that. They brought the dispute forward. The U.S. International Trade Commission reviewed it, the USTR brought the case to the WTO, and that's when China just backed down. So was it smart for the foreign companies not to bring the dispute, push for that, even though it was clear they were going to win? Yeah, maybe it was, because they were fearful of retaliatory measures. In this case, maybe it made more sense. Step back, let someone else, like the U.S. Steelworkers Union, let them bring the case. Retaliation isn't going to harm them in any way. So they were able to step back, sit back, let someone else bring the dispute forward, and benefit from the outcome. So in that case, it might have been the smart move not to use the WTO, not to pressure the U.S. government, but to kind of take a passive role in that case. It made sense.